So it's a pleasure for me to be here today, and I just, a little bit of background, I have it's called a health education degree from Dalhousie, and I seem to be attracted to organizations and things that are all about stigma. When I was at Dalhousie, and I first went in science, and I was going to be the next Florence Nightingale, and I went into nursing, and I didn't know nursing outside of the hospital, and I did not like the hospital experience. And so I moved home and worked at my grandfather's paint store for a couple of years, and long enough to think, I think I need to go back to school. And one thing that when I was in nursing, I really learned that I would much rather do prevention of illness than the treatment. And we don't spend a lot of time on preventing. We're all with illness. But I heard about this health education. It's now called health promotion degree at Dalhousie. And while I was there, one of the professors got involved with an AIDS organization in Halifax and brought in a guest speaker who was diagnosed with AIDS. And at the time, in the late 80s, the early 90s, there's a lot of stigma around HIV/AIDS. And when he spoke in our class, and the first voice stories are so important, that's why it's so great for Pam to talk about that, living with a mental illness, because it really affects you, hearing personal stories. And when I really felt there's social injustice with this person who lost his job and his family members were not, dealing with him. And so when I moved back to Cape Breton, and a public health nurse who was involved with getting going an AIDS organization said, would you like to help start it and get involved? And I said, absolutely. And so that when you start learning about illnesses, when you maybe not you're directly affected, but I started working at the AIDS Coalition, and now today we've morphed into the Ally Center of Cape Breton, and in 1996 when I was there, we opened up the Needle Exchange program. So I got to know folks in the addiction world, and a lot of stigma related to HIV, a lot of stigma related to drug use, and if you have an addiction, and and when I was at the AIDS Coalition, I came out of the proverbial closet when I was 33 years old, and it was a very safe space to be, because finally when I came out, the people said, finally, Jean, we've been waiting. And so it seemed to be like I was the last one to know. But a very supportive environment, so it's really important to talk about your experiences, and because we all somewhere can relate. But today's topic on the mind, body, spirit was I thought it was connecting the dots among the three. And what's your brain got to do with it? Everybody's a Tina Turner fan, because what's love got to do with it? In this case, what's the brain got to do with it? Everything. So one of the things, though, when we're first talking about mental health, what are some of the things that come to mind when you hear of health? What are some words what is health? Diet, so that's a lot of times for eating a healthy diet, that's about health. What are some of the things that come to mind? Hospital comes to health, yeah. Mind, the whole thing, right? So when the World Health Organization describes health, a lot of times people think, if I don't have an illness, that means I'm healthy. But in the World Health Organization, it's a complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So in other words, if just because you don't have an illness doesn't necessarily mean that you're completely healthy. And when I was in the health education program at Dalhousie, one of the professors showed this triangle about describing what health is. And so physical health, mental health, your social and spiritual health. And in the Western world, in our medical society, we really concentrate on just our physical health. Somehow we've got disconnected that our brain and our body is not part of our whole body. So with social or spiritual, what kind of aspect do you think of that is our health? So if physical is our body and mental has to do all with our brain and how it functions, what's our social or spiritual health? What does that involve? Friendships. It's all about relationships. So your spiritual health, if you believe in a higher power, it's your relationship with a higher power, with Mother Earth, with nature, your relationships with families and friends and work colleagues. That's all part of your health, social health. And This is supposed to be an equal triangle because they're all equally as important. But and it's interesting too that when things are going wrong with your brain, it shows up a lot of times in your physical health. So people, and we'll tend to go to the doctor and say, I have a headache, my stomach hurts. We come home with antacids or pills, but we don't look at the underlying what's maybe really causing the physical health. So when you hear the term mental health, what actually comes to your mind? What's the first thing? It's mental illness is what we usually think about. We think of something negative, not positive. But mental health is a positive concept. There's a number of definitions of what is mental health out there. This one is from the UK, and I really like it, and I'll have to turn around and read this, but mental health is the emotional and spiritual resilience that enables us to enjoy life and survive pain, disappointment, and sadness. It's a positive sense of well-being and an underlying belief in our own and others' self-worth. So basically, mental health is meant to be, and our brain is designed so that we can cope with daily events. Mental illness, and including under mental illness or mental health issues, is addiction issues. Because when you have an addiction to a drug, especially, it can cause major changes in the way you think. It's not just in your emotional state and your behavior. It disrupts your ability to work and carry out usual personal relationships. So we're having a mental illness is, and some of the more common ones that we hear about are depression. That has to do with your emotions. I'm going to talk about a little bit about that. Bipolar disorder, and anxiety and trauma-related disorders. Anxiety-related disorders are the most common mental illnesses. Schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder, so that's one that we hear about a lot with, and that really alters our way our brain works as well. And then substance use disorders, you don't actually get a diagnosis of an addiction anymore. It's basically because people think, I'm not an alcoholic, I don't drink that much. Well, as far as a substance use disorder or alcohol, is that how much is it interfering in your life, with your ability to work and to be able to focus? It has nothing to do with how much you're using, how is it interrupting your life? And I'll talk a little bit about that too. But the good news around mental illness and addiction is that with appropriate treatment and support, most people do recover. So just like with the opposite of not having a physical illness doesn't mean that you're physically fit. Just like if you have a serious mental illness, the opposite is not great mental health. The opposite is that you don't have a mental illness. So people living with a mental illness can have really positive mental health, because that's all about support and recovery. There's people with no mental illness that can have really poor mental health. They're struggling with mental health problems, but they don't have an illness. But so they're on two different, systems. The opposite of not a mental illness doesn't mean that you're mentally healthy. 10 years ago, I had a partner who died of lung cancer. And I was working at Public Health Services then, and I can tell you I wasn't the most productive employee in the world when you have a major, where you're dealing with someone who has a terminal illness. And so I had a lot of presenteeism. You hear that you're at work, but your body's there, but your head's not. So I was that, major grief is a common event in people's lives, and you can have a mental health problem. You have trouble focusing, trouble thinking, and so lots of worrying thoughts. So these are all symptoms of a mental health problem. It doesn't mean that you have an illness, but you can be affected by events, right? Is this all making sense? Okay. So our brain, and when I worked at Public Health Services and in health promotion, and I'm kind of sad to say that somehow mental health was in someone else's area. It wasn't my expertise, so I didn't really learn much about it. And I'm so glad now that I moved over to addiction services in 2011, and now we're mental health and addiction services. But I'm learning so much about our brain. If anybody's a Star Trek enthusiast, the last frontier is space, but I think the last frontier is our own brains and trying to figure out how they work. But there are 6 main functions in our brain. And thinking and cognition is just one of those functions. The way we perceive and sense things in our environment is another one. And when you have serious disruption in the way you think and on cognition, the way you process information, the way you perceive your environment, if that's really messed up, that's where the psychotic disorders of when your hallucinations and delusional thinking. So there's a function of your brain is not working properly. The emotion and feeling is all about our moods, and I'm going to talk about that. And our behaviors, our physical, our part of our body, how our blood system works, how our organs work. And then finally, our signaling is this is the part of our brain that really where anxiety a lot of times happens and our stress in our lives, and I'm going to talk a little bit more of that. But just know that when you have a mental health problem or struggling with a mental illness, any one of those functions can be just interrupted. And so that's why it's so hard for sometimes to figure out what's really going on here, because anxiety and depression are really good buddies. A lot of times, my wife now, we've been married for 6 years, discovered just recently that she now has depression. She's been off work for 2 years. She's a clinical therapist, and off work. And depression looks so different in people. So I'm learning a lot more and being the support person for someone who lives with depression and anxiety. And just like Pam, you would never know in a million years by how she presents herself that she's someone living with depression. And it's interesting to know, too, that most of the common mental illnesses like anxiety and depression really start at an early age. And they have their signs and symptoms, and usually 70% of the more common mental illnesses start showing up in the teenage years. This is a 5-year-old brain, and this is a 20-year-old brain. You can kind of see the blue in this picture. The blue means that your brain is maturing, growing, and developing. So if you're a grandparent, parent of a teenager, and I say with substances, delay use as long as possible, because when you introduce a drug at an early age, you can really interfere with the good brain development. And I've been doing a lot of work in the cannabis legislation piece lately, and that's health promoter trying to up the age to at least 21 rather than 19, the same as alcohol, because we're hoping the first age of use will increase as well. Do you know what the average age for Nova Scotia youth to their first drink of alcohol is? It's 13. It was 12.9. Now it's 13.4. But we're being introduced by a lot of drugs at an earlier age. So as far as good brain development, and the good news is our brain is changing and developing throughout our whole life. And so that's why when we do kind of rewire our brain when we introduce drugs, that the good news is, and when you do able to stop using or reducing, then you start to get those your brain working properly again. So, because depression and anxiety disorders are the most common, this is a couple of slides are from the curriculum that Dr. Stan Kritcher and his team developed, and they have it actually in high school curriculum. But emotions are anything that we can feel. And we know these, or feelings, and we also know them as moods. So everyone has a normal range of mood. So our brain helps regulate our moods. And just like a thermostat in a room, you set it at a certain temperature. If it gets too hot, if you have air conditioning, will kick in and keep it at that same temperature. If it gets too cold, the heat kicks in, we're keeping at that same temperature. Just like with our brain, with our mood regulator, we have a normal range. And so some people, their normal range is a little bit lower. They're the Eeyores in life, life, the glass is half empty. And some people are in that the higher end of like, hey, life is great, the glass is half full. But sometimes we get bumped up and we have, well, what's an event that would happen that will put you in a great mood? Win the lottery. And if you win the lottery, do you stay in that really great mood, high mood for a long time? It depends how much money you win, right? But because your mood regulator, if it's working properly, brings you down to your normal mood. It's the same thing if you're having a life event that kind of brings you down. If your mood regulator is working properly, it's going to bring you back up to your normal mood. What happens with depression is you get stuck in this low mood. And a lot of times, so it's not just as, easy to say, just snap out of it, be happy, because there's something going on with your brain is not working properly. And a lot of times, if with clinical depression that lasts a long time, the good news is with treatment that you can actually improve. Now, moods is an ongoing inner feeling. What kind of mood do you think these two are in? They look pretty miserable, right? So a lot of times, but it's normal for us to look at someone and judge how they're feeling. Sometimes a lot of times we're wrong, but my wife who lives with depression has learned at a very early age, you put on a happy face in public. So by looking at her, it's really hard to believe that you're suffering. And so it's the same with, doesn't mean that they're not enjoying a great, having a laugh inside, but it's basically, that's where this, the misunderstanding, especially with people, like it's kind of like if a sore back, you can't see it, so you don't really, but they really have a sore back, or are they just trying to get out of, lifting all those boxes? It's the same with, if you can't see what's happening in their brain, the constant worrying thoughts, and a lot of times what we do see, though, are physical symptoms. And so people, it's so much easier to complain, oh, I've got a headache, my neck is sore, my stomach aches, and that's what you hear from kids with anxiety. But when people are saying, I'm feeling sad, it's basically, oh, come and watch this funny show and that will hear you. But when there's something wrong with your brain, it's not that easy. So another really important function is that fight or flight response. So that's our signaling kind of response. Why do we need a fight or flight response? Protect ourselves, right? So if there's something, a real threat for your physical health, if you're walking along the road and somebody swerves in front of you, you're not going to, which way should I jump? You don't have time. You need a mechanism that just snaps into action. And so what happens is your brain, danger. So it's not just necessarily our physical health socially. If somebody seems really aggressive and you're thinking you're going to get in a fight or an argument with them, the same response happens. You get focused on that threat, you get tunnel vision, your hearing even is threatened. You can't hear anything outside because you're just focused on this person or there's something that's threatening you. And your heart starts to beat faster because you're trying to get that adrenaline, around in your system. And some people start to sweat. And it's all that preparation. Have you ever felt that you've gotten a certain fright or you're ready to action? Just remember how that feels, right? So we can't stop that from happening. It's an automatic reaction. Our body senses danger, boom, we take into action. So you're ready to fight or flee. With anxiety, and when that part of your brain is not working properly, your brain is registering danger, there's something to worry about here. And that whole cascade of events that happens, your heart beats faster, you start to sweat, and all that things of tension starts to happen. And so that's the same response that you have for stress. When you have stress response, the same thing happens in that you're thinking there's something to worry about, there's some danger, and so a lot of times people are feeling that anxiety, and a lot of times, how do you help that feeling? Stop doing whatever is scaring you, right, to avoid it. So with people experience with anxiety disorders, have certain phobias and panic attacks, feel like you're having a heart attack, it's because of this brain is doing all the system for you. When you're stressed, so when you're constant stress, what happens is you need your immune system because you're ready for that fight or that long run you're going to have. So your digestive system is not working properly, and your immune system doesn't need to work at that moment. So when you're constantly under stress, it has nothing to do with whether you have an anxiety disorder. If you're constantly under stress, a lot of times people come down with colds and flus, when exam time or when you really have a lot of going on. Before Christmas or at Christmas time, I got shingles. I'm 54 now, so I guess I'm in that category, on my face. And I was thinking, wow, like usually it's if you're under a lot of stress that you'll get something like that. And I realized, well, my wife is off with depression, my father's diagnosed with cancer, I had a dog we had to put down, and all before Christmas. So, okay, that makes sense. My body is telling me that I'm under stress. And so a lot of times with stress, if it lasts too long, you become distressed. And then just the stress that you have in your life can cause major health problems. And that's why if you're a caregiver for someone, when I facilitated with a couple of folks here, the Families Matter group, which is a support group for people that are supporting someone who's living with mental illness or a substance use disorder. And a lot of time people come and think, I want to come here to help fix my loved one. And really it's about self-care. Because when my former partner, when she was dying of lung cancer, I was the most unhealthy myself. I gained a ton of weight, and I wasn't, doing things to keep myself healthy. I think I was giving it all to my partner. And realizing, just like Pam said with the mask, you got to take care of yourself because you're not going to be of use to anyone. And the stress of it all really starts showing. So the chronic stress, and so when we're stressed in this culture of Cape Breton and Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada, what do people turn to when you're stressed? Drugs, right? And so people use drugs in general usually to feel good. If you're much younger and you're trying those drugs for the first time, usually you get those fun experiences of high, but a lot of people want to feel better because they're feeling anxiety, they're feeling the worries, they're feeling the tension, they're feeling hopeless. And when I had said that 70% of the more common mental illnesses start in your teenage years, you can see the combination of your brain isn't fully developed yet. The last part of your brain to develop is your prefrontal cortex, that place where you make good executive functioning and decision making. So teenagers take risks anyway. And then we have a drug like alcohol, especially. The three most commonly used drugs for youth: alcohol, cannabis, and tobacco. So so when you can see why it's so attractive to you, because if you're feeling those symptoms of anxiety and you have such stigma around, you're not supposed to talk about it, and then you have a drug that makes you feel better. I've got 10 minutes. So the reason that you feel better, the reason you feel better is because of this neurotransmitter called dopamine. Have you heard of dopamine? So we need dopamine because it's to help us feel good, because it's part of our reward system. And so, but dopamine also is involved with our movement, our motivation, and it's the whole reward. I'm just going to hold this. So this is a little bit technical, but when you take in a drug, or actually we have a natural reward system. So we need to survive as a species, so we need to eat, and a lot of times to have sex, to have babies. And so there's a couple of things there that releases dopamine, that it feels good because we want to eat and we want to have babies. So that's a natural reward system. When you take in a drug, it doesn't matter what it is, if it's nicotine, if it's alcohol, if it's painkillers, whatever the drug is, you actually release more of that dopamine. And if you're doing it constantly, what happens is you get the hippocampus area, which lays the memory. I had that DQ ice cream, it tasted great, I remember that, and the next time I see the DQ sign, I'm really triggered. Wow, that was really great when I had that ice cream there. And the amygdala area is that area where you do that conditioned response. So if you do it often enough, you associate everything that you do around it with that drug. So if anybody's ever tried, used cigarettes and they tried to quit, and they're like, oh, I can't drive in the car anymore because I'm really triggered. I really want to, or I can't go on the phone because every time I was on the phone I would smoke. All these things that you associate with your drug, it's really get triggered because you've relayed this conditioned response that every time I got triggered with it. And so that's why with it's so difficult to come off a drug, and why you actually a relapse is so common is because just like if you're trying to diet and stay away from chocolate and ice cream, that whenever you see an ad on TV or a sign, you're really triggered. Wow, that I'm really craving this now. Even when in the needle exchange, some people who've stopped using drugs, and just the sight of the needle would sometimes start producing the high because they associated with the drug use. So it's not just dopamine, though. You're interrupting your serotonin and your glutamate, and people know serotonin is one of the drugs that they try for anti-anxiety and depression. Is serotonin help regulate your mood. So a lot of the drugs that we take to help with anxiety and depression is to try to keep that serotonin more in your brain. So substance use disorders, like I said, doesn't matter about how much you're drinking. It's about basically how is it interfering with your life. It's usually rated from mild, moderate to severe. There's a whole bunch of categories and questions. And if you have 2 or more, you're mild, and 3 or more, and 6 or 7 is severe. A lot of times with severe, though, those are the folks who come into treatment, but they usually have loss of control of the drug. They have really strong compulsions to use, and they have they still use despite the adverse consequences. So I'm still using alcohol even though I've lost my relationships or lost my job. You're still gambling maybe, it's a behavioral thing, even though you maybe lost your life savings, because you're rewiring your brain. And so just like the stigma around mental illness, a huge stigma around substance use disorders, this is a healthy brain, and this is all the metabolism, all the mechanisms, your neurotransmitters working good, and that's all the yellow and the red. And it's less, you can't see a lot of those same mechanisms. This is someone who's used a lot of cocaine. And same with, here's a healthy heart, here's a diseased heart. So the things with why people use is a lot of times is to self-medicate. A lot of people that are in your gut both have a substance use disorder and they have a mental illness. Many people, when they get a diagnosis of a mental illness, especially anxiety in their 30s and 40s, a lot of times they've been using drugs to help medicate. And so they have 2 problems going on. And just wanted to quickly, too, about in a society, that we do have low-risk drinking guidelines, and over on the table there I have a little sheet on the resource about what they are. But how many drinks do you think would be considered heavy drinking? How many drinks in one sitting would be considered heavy drinking? 3? So it is 3, it's 4, 5 or more for men, 3, 4 or more for women. And a lot of times, this is hard to see, but I said, I'm not a heavy drinker. I have 1 glass of wine a night, that's it. And here's the wine glass, it's bigger than our head. So a lot of times is knowing what is in a standard drink. And if you want to know more about that, I can help you out today. But so we have a double whammy when you age, because there's a whole stigma with aging and aging process. And common beliefs about the aging is that you have all these the neurotransmitters or things that you're born with, you just continually decline, but it's not true. All of our experiences and things that we do to keep us healthy is keeping our brain healthy. And I have the watch out for senior citizens here. But basically, the stigma around mental illness and addiction prevents people from seeking help and to talking about it. I'm from a Scottish background. It's a real sign of weakness to show that if you can't cope. When a good friend of mine said, Jean, after my partner died, and said, Jean, because I wasn't myself, she said, do you think you need to see a grief counselor? I'm like, I am so fine. I don't know what you're talking about. I know Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. I worked at the AIDS Coalition for years, and so I was in complete denial that there was anything wrong. So and it's because of the stigma, I think, of that Oh, what do you mean, I can't cope? To know that loneliness is not normal part of aging. Many people think, oh, it's just depression, they're old, or they're just, natural, you're lonely, then people move away. But that's not, feeling of like that is not normal. And so one of the things that we do from loneliness, that there is a real risk of depression because of that. There's increased mortality, so that basically just loneliness has seemed to be that it's twice as unhealthy as obesity, and that is like equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day on your health, just the loneliness. And then a 2012 study found that lonely people had a 64% increased chance of developing clinical dementia compared to people who were better connected. That's why community and connection, and part of the whole theme of mind, body, spirit, is really trying to ending that isolation that people feel. This is a website. I got 2 more minutes? Okay, I did the 2-minute video right after this. The Fountain of Health has 5 kind of prescriptions of what you can do, and this is kind of like the theme of even the workshops. But it's a Nova Scotia website too, and so it's like all positive psychiatry. But the importance of social activity. Get out and talk to someone, make those connections like Pam was talking about. And I really hate to say it, but all the research shows that being physically active is so important. We think it's good for our heart health. It's feeding our brain. We're getting oxygen to our brain. We really need our brain to be working as well, and it's really greedy for oxygen. So physical activity, any activity, walking, doesn't have to be like going on the treadmill. And mental health, being mindful about what's, and that's what kind of meditation and yoga, but really getting in touch with your feelings. And lifelong learning, challenging your brain. And then finally, that positive attitude, like Pam had talked about, it really makes a difference. And there's research, and on this site, Fountain of Health, it gives you all this about all the importance of all of these items.